Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are continuing with our look at the local church and the importance of being a part of the local church. One of the things today is, sorry, my dog's in the background. One of the things today, first off, I just finished being outside and wearing a hat, so therefore I'm going to keep it on for the sake of you all. Um, but one of the things that, when it comes to the church, I think that's really important is to see how it is very much like a family. And like a family, we are called to spread the word to each other throughout the generations. And so, what better set of scriptures to do that than this call in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, for parents to pass on the word to their children. And yes, this passage is talking about parenting, but I think there is something that we can take away from this, especially with a very communal culture that ancient Israel was. So, Deuteronomy chapter 6, we're going to look at verses 4. We're going to look at verses 4 through 9. So, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So, we've actually covered this passage before when we were looking at it through the lens of what it's getting at when it's talking about parenting. Now, I do want to take it a step further. I'm not necessarily saying I'm going to take this out of context. This is strictly for the calling of Israelites to adhere to the greatest commandment, which is loving God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. But within a context, I do see the local church being as a group of believers that do pass down the word of God to those that are younger, and not necessarily age either. I'm talking about younger in the faith. And I think a local church can do that. Now, again, this passage is talking about parenting. I'm not going to say that's talking specifically about the local church because that would be taken out of context. But I do think that there are some things here that we can obviously put into practice in the local church context. So, first, loving the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Well, as we talked about earlier when we covered this passage, what does that mean? Well, it means to love God with everything that you do, with your heart, with all your desires, with your soul. The the a lot of people think that the soul could be connected with the conscience. I could see that. So maybe we're talking about your heart is your desires, the soul is what your thought life, basically, what you're thinking, and then all of your might, the things that you do, the physical, right? So basically, it's encompassing everything that we do. So in everything that we do, we are to love the Lord our God, and so I think that's pretty much what we're seeing here in verse 5 of Deuteronomy chapter 6. But then it goes on. And these words that I command you today shall be on your hearts. So these commandments of the Lord, the word of God, is not just supposed to be on like um, the walls of our social media accounts. They're not supposed to just be written down on a notepad. They are to be, in a sense, at our deepest desire. The Word of God should be our deepest desire. Doesn't mean that will always be that, right? Because we're not perfect, but it should be one of, if, well, should be the deepest desire of our hearts, because it's the Word of God. Now, here's where I think it obviously goes into parenting in verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children. But I think this is where we can start to see a communal aspect of this passage that then we can see within the local church. Look at the rest of verse 7. And shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. So the idea here is you should be focused on the Lord, no matter whether it's in a private setting or a public setting. I think this idea, and when you walk by the way, I think that is just doing life. I think that's pretty much what it's getting at. It could be as straightforward as like when you're walking the sidewalk, but my guess, especially with the idea of when you sit in your house, this private kind of life that we have. So I think when it's talking about, and when you walk by the way, I think it's talking about the public life that we have, the communal life that we have. And then when you lie down and when you rise is just talking about uh, following the Lord no matter what time of day it is. I think that's kind of what it's getting at. So for us, as being in well, and it actually continues. Let's look at that verse. Verses 8 and 9, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. So it's completely obvious who you serve. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Again, making it completely obvious to whom you serve. Now, I think verses 7, 8, and 9 give us a glimpse into how we as a local church can can flesh this out. So, yes, in a parenting situation, you want to pass things down. And this is the immediate context of this verse, of this passage. With us as a local church, we are made of those that are, yes, older in life, but also older in our spiritual life as well. You could have somebody that just came to know Jesus at the age of 70, and yet you could have somebody that knows Jesus that is 40, and yet they've known Jesus for 30 years. So even though they're younger in actual life, that does they have been a believer for 30 years, so they've gone through a lot of the toil of what it means to be a believer in our day and age, whereas the 70-year-old has gone through what it means to just be alive, right? But they can teach each other. I think that's important to see. So when we talk about passing on the legacy of the gospel to those that are younger, that's not necessarily meaning the actual younger person in age, even though that's important. That's important. But I think a lot of the times it can mean passing on to somebody that's younger in spiritual age, that they have not been a follower of Jesus for as long as you have. I think there's a lot that you, even if you're younger in actual age, can teach somebody that has not been a believer as long as you have. So for me, for instance, I have, I believe, next summer will be 25 years that I've been a believer, which is really cool to think about. Now, there are some out there that are older than me physically that have more life wisdom, and yet maybe they're 5 years. They've known Jesus for 5 years, or for less, or basically less than I have. Than I've been a believer. So there are some things that I can show them and I can pass down to them as somebody that's older in spiritual age. But then there are some things that they can pass down to me that are life applicable because they've lived longer in the actual world. So it's kind of cool to see how we can pass that on. And being a part of a local church, you get to experience that. Whereas if you're not part of a local church, you don't really get to see that very often, or you don't get to be a part of it directly. And so that's another reason why I think the local church is incredibly important, and being a part of one is incredibly important as well. So next week we will dive more into this idea about how the local church is a body of believers. And then we will also talk about doing life together. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together, will reference that a little bit. So thank you for spending time with me today on this Friday, and I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, and I'll see you next week with a Broadman Word. Thanks.